booklet up from Upper Dome 1. There is a booklet available. I think it's $10. The booklet has all the notes, all the PowerPoint notes, as well as kind of some additional resource information that I'll refer to kind of as we go along in the class. So if you want that, now's a great time to run up and grab that. Or like I said, if you want to just take notes on your own, you're welcome to do that as well. And if at any time you need to use the restrooms or just kind of right down this hallway, this is a 2-hour lecture, and there's a lot of information. If none of you have been to this lecture before, we repeat it every month. So if there's something you miss, you can always come back next month, or it's also available as a recorded version online. And so I tend to, the content and the PowerPoint are the same. I tend to kind of go off on different tangents. So, each class is a little bit different, but if there is something you missed or something you wanted to hear over again, you can go online on our YouTube page, just search for Reardon Clinic, and that will pull up all the lectures that we've done here. Really, recently, but also they have a bunch of archived lectures from the past 10 to 15 years up there. So we're good. Okay. All right. So I guess we're live. So we can go ahead and get started. I am Dr. Ann. I'm one of our practitioners here at the Reardon Clinic. I'm a chiropractor, but I also do functional medicine, mostly in the realm of pediatrics. So I see most of the children that come through our clinic here. And so, but probably my favorite thing to talk about is what we're going to talk about today, food as medicine. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and it's something that I feel like is really at the root of most chronic diseases that we see in the world today. And so, today this class, I use this class kind of as a foundational class for people. Hopefully, at the end of this class, you won't feel like I've told you what you need to do, but really provided you the information and provided you the framework to help you make decisions in the world today. Because, there's so many conflicting viewpoints. Eat this, don't eat that, eat, this or do this. And it's just kind of like, it's almost overwhelming to try and figure out what it is we're supposed to be doing. So hopefully today I'll give you the framework so that you can make decisions that work well for you in your lifestyle and your biochemistry. And so I like to start off with this quote, the foods you eat can either be the safest, most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. And you kind of have to think about food, especially food in our modern world, like that. Most people don't feel an immediate effect from the foods that they eat. You're not going to keel over and die like our ancestors, who, chose the wrong berry and ate a poisonous berry, that could be the end of their life very quickly. Thankfully we live in a world where you can go to the grocery store and purchase most foods and they're not going to kill you, at least immediately. And so, but it becomes a little bit more insidious because these food choices over time are impacting our health in a significant way. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, all the little insidious things we're choosing in our diet that are impacting our health. So kind of the outline of where we're headed with this class, there's 3 major segments. We're going to talk first of all about inflammation, and we'll actually spend most of the class talking about this first section. And, this is just a really, really important concept of what inflammation is and how it connects with our diet. But we are also going to be talking about leaky gut. Has everybody heard that term before? Yes. It's amazing. I've actually been doing this class for 3 years, and 3 years ago, most people in the room had not heard of leaky gut, and just within the past few years, this has kind of become part of our, normal conversation because it is such a big deal in our world today. So we'll talk about what exactly leaky gut is, how it connects with some of the conditions we're seeing today. And then also at the end, we'll talk about how do we heal the gut? What are some of the nutrients we need? What are some of the dietary changes we can make? What do we need to do to actually heal our digestive system? So before we jump into all this, I like to do what I call a functional review of digestion, because most people who, have had anatomy and physiology, it's probably been a few years, since you've studied this stuff. And most of the time too, even me, when I was in school and we studied anatomy and physiology, looking at it from a functional perspective is very different than looking at it from an anatomical perspective. And so, for a lot of people though, this is kind of a black box. You take something very appetizing and it goes in, and then it comes out something very unappetizing. So what's happening in that in-between space is functionally what we're going to talk about. So when we talk about digestion, really the first step of digestion is in the mouth. So the saliva that we have has digestive enzymes in it that help us break down carbohydrates. So that's why, if you were to take a whole handful of crackers, like saltine crackers, and try and eat them all at once, you probably end up choking and gagging on it because you don't have enough digestive enzymes, to digest those carbohydrates. Versus if you just did one cracker, the digestive enzymes would soften that and you could swallow it. So those enzymes exist in our saliva. And interesting fact about that is parents always ask, when should I introduce rice cereal for my baby? Until you have teeth, you are not making those digestive enzymes. So I always encourage parents to wait until their baby has teeth before introducing, rice cereal, which actually I don't recommend rice cereal a whole lot, but before introducing a lot of solid foods. So, but the mechanics of chewing, start breaking down your food as well as those digestive enzymes. So that by the time you swallow your food and it goes down this tube right here, your esophagus, and it gets into the stomach, by the time it's in the stomach, it's already partially broken down. Now, the stomach is a critical step in the digestive process. And I'm kind of here to advocate for the stomach because I feel like the stomach has got a bad rap, with everybody who has the symptom of reflux these days. The latest statistic I've heard is 10% of Americans are on some sort of an acid blocker, and that's probably a conservative amount. There's probably more that aren't reporting it. But what is it? Do we just have this epidemic of acid in our world today? Does everybody just have too much acid? And I don't think that's the case because acid in the stomach is a critically important step because the hydrochloric acid that the stomach releases is what breaks down our proteins. So proteins are made up of a lot of little building blocks called amino acids. And I think of amino acids like Legos. They're different sizes, different colors, different shapes. And so when that acid starts breaking down those proteins, it makes those amino acids available so that by the time you get into the small intestine here, your body can absorb those amino acids. And we absorb the amino acids, and then the body then uses those amino acids to repair the body, repair everything, repair muscle, repair the lining of your digestive tract, to make neurotransmitters. Most everything in the body requires these amino acids. So if you don't have enough stomach acid and you're not adequately breaking down your proteins, not only are you not going to have enough of these bioavailable amino acids, but you're also going to leave food in larger chunks that are going to make you susceptible to food sensitivity. So it's like if you're not fully breaking down corn, with your stomach acid, by the time that partially digested corn gets into the small intestine, if you've got leaky gut and that partially digested corn makes its way across that barrier system, the immune system is going to react to it. And when the immune system starts reacting to it, that's how we develop a food sensitivity. So a lot of it starts here in the stomach with properly digesting your proteins. Now, the other thing that this stomach acid does is it also kills pathogens. So viruses, bacteria, fungal infections, parasites, things that are in your food that even the best cooked, best preserved food is still going to have some bacteria on it. So the stomach is an important step in killing those pathogens so that they don't get into the digestive tract further along. So then the question is, well, why do so many people have reflux? What is causing this symptom? And ironically enough, it's actually that we have too little stomach acid for most people. And the reason too little stomach acid causes the symptoms of reflux is when your stomach releases that hydrochloric acid and the stomach starts to expand, that sends a signal to your brain, and your brain then triggers a mechanism that closes off a sphincter that we have right here. It's called the lower esophageal sphincter. When that sphincter closes, it keeps all the contents of the stomach in the stomach because the stomach is also a big muscle. So that stomach is going to start churning, pretty strongly to break down that food. And so if that sphincter doesn't close, as soon as the stomach starts churning, the contents of the stomach can reflux up into the esophagus. And so that is, for most people, what is causing their symptom of reflux. It's actually too little acid. And the reason we have too little acid is it's a lot of the foods we're eating, especially the grains that we're eating. A lot of wheat, a lot of corn, a lot of foods are high in something called lectins. And lectins block stomach acid. So, but that's a whole other conversation. But suffice to say, one of the biggest reasons people have the symptom of reflux is too little acid. The second biggest reason is food sensitivities. So when the stomach gets inflamed because you're eating a lot of foods you're sensitive to, that can also cause the symptom of reflux. Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. Yeah. So a lot of times they won't be making, because there's a hormone called trypsin that's released in the stomach, that causes the stomach lining to release the hydrochloric acid. So if you've had gastric bypass, if part of the stomach has been either removed or cut off, then there's a good chance that they're not making as much of that trypsin. And so, but because they have had that surgery, I would be real careful with treating stomach acid, just because they are just a kind of a different case scenario. So I'd do it under the help of a doctor. So then after the stomach churns up, the food, and the acid starts breaking down the proteins, the contents of the stomach then leave and they go into what's called the duodenum. And the duodenum is an important part of the small intestine because that's where the pancreas sits right here behind the stomach. The pancreas starts dumping digestive enzymes. And has anybody heard of digestive enzymes, taking that as a supplement? Some people take that as a supplement. Probably the most well-known digestive enzyme is lactase. Everyone knows someone who's lactose intolerant. When you're lactose intolerant, what that means is you don't make enough lactase. Your pancreas, for whatever reason, just doesn't make that enzyme. But that's not the only enzyme the pancreas releases. The pancreas also releases enzymes that help us break down fats, certain ones that help us break down carbohydrates, so amylases, lipases, and then other proteins. And so there's a whole range of different digestive enzymes that get dumped, right here in that spot so that the body will further break down the food that we've eaten. Because the whole goal is to kind of get food down into the smallest component part, because once we get here into the small intestine, the small intestine's job is to absorb everything that the body needs. All the nutrients, all the sugars, all the amino acids, all the, the fats, a lot of that gets absorbed here in the small intestine. And so you want food in the smallest pieces possible so that the body can absorb directly what it needs. So this whole section, as the food's winding through the whole small intestine, it's absorbing so that by the time it gets here to the large intestine or the colon's main job is elimination. So it's taking all the waste. So not only the waste from the food that you've eaten, but also here's your liver right here and the bile duct, the gallbladder. That's also dumping waste from the body into the digestive tract so that you can then eliminate that waste. So that can be waste such as like hormones. When you're women break down estrogen. Estrogen gets dumped in a water-soluble form into the digestive tract so that it can be eliminated. Your testosterone, your adrenal hormones, even, the toxicity of things you're exposed to, what you breathe in, what's in your water, in your makeup, the cosmetics, all the chemicals we're exposed to, the liver helps kind of filter and it dumps a lot of the toxic waste into the digestive tract so that it can then be eliminated. So this last step, elimination, is so critically important. And in fact, I always say, if you have to leave early from this class or if you get nothing else out, please know that if you're not feeling well, try just, whatever you need to do to poop every day, apart from taking Miralax, but like magnesium, aloe vera, whatever you need, probiotics, because pooping every single day is one of the most important functions to maintaining your health, because you have to get rid of all those toxins that your body is processing, because for a lot of people, they don't have a bowel movement every day, and that stuff sits, and the longer it sits, it can be reabsorbed back into your system. And so, like for instance, some women have hormonal imbalances, estrogen imbalances, because they're reabsorbing those estrogen metabolites because they're not eliminating them in their bowels. Kids these days, I don't know if anybody has ever either had a kid or babysat for a kid that doesn't poop every day. But, according to pediatricians, it's normal to go a week, for kids and to not poop. But if any of you have ever experienced a kid that hasn't pooped in a week, they are miserable to be around. They are irritable. And so, that's how we are as adults. And so, so elimination is key. And sorry to get a little nitty gritty here before lunch, but when we actually have a bowel movement, about 75% of the bulk of that bowel movement is actually bacteria. So you have a lot of the bacteria, most of the bacteria, that good microbiome bacteria exists in the colon, in this area right here. So when you're having a bowel movement, what's happening is some of that bacteria is sloughing off the walls, and that's what helps you have a bowel movement. It helps things move along. And so, so that microbiome, which we'll talk more about as we go, is just fiercely under attack in our world today. There's so many things that are disrupting that bacterial system and creating a lot of the bowel issues we see today. I mean, most people, when you kind of start digging into their history, have some sort of bowel issue, whether it's diarrhea, constipation, irritable bowel, bloating after meals, indigestion, reflux. Most people have some sort of digestive issue. And so a lot of that can be traced back to how well we are eliminating. So that's kind of digestion 101. Does anybody have any questions about that before we go on? And I didn't mention this in the beginning, but I like to keep this class more informal. So if you have any questions, feel free, raise your hand, stop me. Like I said, I'll go off on tangents. And but yeah.
So are laxatives a bad thing? I heard you say magnesium and aloe vera.
Yeah, so it depends on how you're using the laxatives. I honestly find a lot of people are constipated because they have a magnesium deficiency, because magnesium not only has a bit of a laxative effect, but magnesium is important for what's called peristalsis. So peristalsis, you actually have smooth muscle in the lining of your small and your large intestine. And so you need magnesium for that muscle contraction to move things along. Because some people, again, it's a little gross here, but some people do have a bowel movement every day, but they're still carrying around 10 pounds of fecal matter in their colon. So just because you're having a bowel movement every day doesn't mean you're fully eliminating all of your bowels. And so, so having that peristaltic movement is important. And so magnesium is important for that. And so now to answer your question, I always like to get to the root cause of why you're not having a bowel movement every day. In the meantime, I'm not opposed to using some natural substances that will help that process along, because some people do need a little bit more help. But while you're doing that, you'll want to still be investigating, do you have disruption in the flora, the bacteria, which is most people, that's their issue, or, do you have a magnesium deficiency, or is there something else going on? And so, but in the meantime, do what you got to do to have a bowel movement. So, yeah.
What about cleanses and other
things? Yeah, so the question was, what about cleanses? And, cleanses, the right cleanse can be really, really great. But what I always tell people is you don't ever want to start something that's detoxifying your liver until you are regularly moving your bowels, because all that's going to do is you're going to be supporting the liver in some of your phase 1, phase 2 detox, and you'll be dumping a whole lot of toxins into a digestive system that can't get rid of it. And so, cleanses, I personally think that most people do really well having some sort of a detox or a cleanse twice a year just to kind of reset, your system. But I would just make sure it's the right one. And it's actually a good segue. We actually lead twice a year a 21-day detox program here at the Reardon Clinic, and we're getting ready to start that here coming up the end of April. So, so if you've never done a cleanse before, that's a great way to walk through that whole process with us. Colonics are great. I think, yeah. The colonics can be a great way of maintaining, good flow. You just want to make sure you're replenishing all of that bacteria. Yeah. That what word? Cereals. Yeah. 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 So what I was referring to were infants. So introducing like rice cereal in an infant, some parents will start that around 4 or 5 months before an infant has teeth. And if they don't have the teeth, they don't have the digestive enzymes to break that down. Now, to answer your question about cereals, I'm not a huge fan of recommending cereals just because most cereals today are highly processed. And so, I always think, if you have to add nutrients, if you have to add vitamins back into something, if you have to fortify it because you've stripped so much away, to me, that's a big red flag that's probably not the most nutrient dense. And what we found is a lot of the forms of those nutrients that they are fortifying are not forms that your body can use. So as far as cereals go, I'm not a huge fan. And we'll talk more about that when we start talking about blood sugar and stuff because, I'm also, everything in moderation, so I'm never one to be too extreme as far as when it comes to diet. But, but there are better choices than most of the cereals that are out there. Yeah. Yeah, so apple cider vinegar. Yeah, so that's a great question. So that's actually what I typically recommend for people who suspect they have low stomach acid. That's usually kind of step number one is to do about a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar about 10 minutes before your meals. And that will kind of help rev up that acid in your stomach, help with digestion. So that can be a great first step. And that's actually, interestingly enough, I talk about that later in the class. And that's probably from this class, the number one takeaway. I've gotten feedback from people that they're like, I did the apple cider vinegar and I got off my Prilosec or off my Prevacid. So that it is a really, really great way to support stomach acid. So yeah, was there one more question? Nope. Okay. So we'll kind of keep scooting along here. So I'm going to kind of skip through some of this. So the question we kind of want to answer, with this class today is what has changed in our modern diet that makes us so sick? Because we have a lot of kind of modern day chronic diseases. You think heart disease, cancer, diabetes, this is why our medical system is so broken and so expensive is we're paying for the management of these diseases. And in my opinion, we're managing them the wrong way. And we're managing them in a very expensive way by giving people drugs that don't ever really fix the problem, but they just manage the symptoms. And so, before we can kind of get into how do we treat those, we have to take a step back and figure out what has changed in our diet and why is what we're eating making us so sick. And, the answer is there isn't one thing, that's doing it. But the thing that does connect all of the bad choices we're making is all of the bad choices we are making are creating an environment of inflammation in the body. And, inflammation is kind of one of those terms I love to talk about because most people have heard of inflammation before and they're like, yeah, I kind of know what that is. It's not a good thing. It causes pain. It causes swelling, but when you get down to it, does anybody know what is inflammation actually doing in the body? Does anybody have any idea? Breaking it down. Yep, you're exactly right. So inflammation's job is to break down damaged tissue. So for instance, great example of this is you sprain your ankle. If you sprain your ankle, you damage the soft tissue of that joint. And so all these inflammatory cells come into that space and it's almost like I think of them like little Pac-Man. They start kind of eating away and breaking down all the damaged tissue. And in the process, it creates swelling, it creates pain, it creates heat. So that process is very, very important for the healing process. But the reason why they say, as soon as you sprain your ankle, elevate it, ice it, compress it, is they want you need that inflammation, but you also want that inflammation gone as quickly as possible. Because if inflammation sticks around too long, longer than it's needed, it's going to continue to do that. It's going to continue to break down tissue. And so eventually, it's not going to discriminate against the damaged tissue and you might start breaking down healthy tissue. So that's kind of an example of healthy inflammation. When you have an injury, a very isolated injury, that is inflammation doing exactly what it needs to. It's localized, it's visible, you have all the symptoms. And then this is the most important thing is it is acute. So it is a short-lived inflammatory response. Now, where inflammation becomes unhealthy, where it becomes, a big problem for us is when it's systemic, so you have this inflammation being triggered kind of all over the body. I kind of think of like a fire and you get sparks that are flying off of that fire and those sparks are lighting fires other places. That's kind of the picture you can think about what happens in the body, when it becomes systemic. Sometimes it's undetectable, so we don't feel the effects of inflammation until, it's really far progressed. So something like that, think arthritis. You can have an inflammatory response in your joints for 10, 15 years, but it's not until you get bone on bone that all of a sudden you start feeling the effects of that inflammation. And the biggest thing is when inflammation becomes chronic, so again, it's that fire that's smoldering that the body isn't able to put out, and as long as that fire is smoldering, it's going to create damage in different areas of the body. So another classic example of this unhealthy inflammation is cardiovascular disease. We have been programmed to think that cardiovascular disease is a cholesterol issue. You've just got to take your statin and, not eat any red meat or eggs and you'll be fine. But in fact, the cardiovascular disease is not a cholesterol issue. And they've shown that, reducing your cholesterol 50-50, whether or not that's going to prevent, a heart attack or not. But what they do know is that cardiovascular disease starts off as an inflammatory response. So if you think about your arteries, what happens with inflammation is you get inflammation in the lining of the arteries. And then inflammation in the lining of the arteries starts to break down, that lining. And so cholesterol then that's floating by in the bloodstream either gets deposited in that area or, it kind of gets stuck, in those areas. So eventually it is the cholesterol that will constrict that blood vessel, but it started off as an inflammatory response, not as a cholesterol issue. In fact, they've actually shown that people who have higher cholesterol levels live longer. So cholesterol has a lot of really important things that it does in the body. So like I said, inflammation, the key with inflammation is you want it to be in balance. So you want to be able to turn on inflammation when it's needed, when you're injured, but then you also want to be able to turn off inflammation when it's not needed anymore. So once your ankle, once you've sprained your ankle and it's swelled and inflammation has done its job, you want to be able to turn that inflammatory response off as quickly as you can. But where most people are at is they are stuck in this pro-inflammatory state. So, they have way more of the cells that are turning on inflammation and not enough of the cells that turn it off. And so the example I like to give to illustrate this is if you had two people that went out and hiked 8 miles. Hiking 8 miles is going to create wear and tear on your joints, on your muscles. So if the first person number one is in a healthy, balanced inflammatory state, meaning they can turn on inflammation, but they can also turn it off. After hiking 8 miles, they're probably going to get back that night. They're going to be a little bit sore, a little bit achy, a little bit tired. They're going to feel a little bit inflamed, but they're going to wake up the next morning and feel fine. Whereas if you have somebody who's in this sort of a state where they have more of these cells that turn on inflammation, not enough of the ones that turn them off, that exact same person can go out and hike 8 miles and they're sore for a week after because they turned on that inflammatory response by hiking, but they weren't able to turn it off. They weren't able to muster enough of a response to turn it off. And that's where a lot of people are at, is we live in a world full of triggers. They're constantly triggering inflammation. And rather than being able to turn that inflammation off, we are stuck in this state of chronic inflammation. And a big trigger to inflammation is diet, which is where we're headed with this. So what does inflammation have to do with my diet? What is it that we're eating that's putting us in this imbalanced state where we're more in this pro-inflammatory state? And to answer that question, we're going to go back and kind of look historically. When you look at what our ancestors ate, and when we talk about kind of the ancestral diet, we're talking more about kind of a hunter-gatherer sort of diet. They ate that sort of diet for thousands and thousands of years. And when you look at kind of how the diet has shifted, especially kind of in the last, say, 100 years, during, the Industrial Revolution and kind of our fast food revolution we're in today, when you look at how radically the diet has shifted, it's almost like our digestive system doesn't know what to do with the food that we're giving it today. Our digestive system was not designed for the world that we live in. And when I give this class, I always kind of joke that, maybe if you gave us, 500 to 1,000 years, we could live off of glycemic index. So we're going to look at sugar and what impact does sugar have, which that's a critically important topic when you look at the skyrocketing rates of obesity in our world. And then we're also going to look at ORAC score. So we're going to look at color. So let me explain what each of these are. So number one, a whole food. And again, if you're going to tune me out the rest of the class, wake up for 1 second because this is the most important thing I can teach in this class. Because if you get this, then everything else, kind of connects back to this. But this idea is if you want to eat foods in their original state. So eating foods as a whole food. So that means you're eating foods that haven't been altered, you haven't taken anything away, they haven't been boxed, they haven't been canned. The example I give here is eating an apple. When you eat an apple, you're eating as nature designed it, that fruit. It's got all the fiber, all the nutrients, everything you need kind of in that nice, neat little package. But when you take that apple and you cook it, and you take the peel off, you add some sugar, add some cinnamon, you make applesauce. Applesauce isn't a bad food choice, but you've lost some of the nutritional value that original apple had. And then you could take that a couple steps further and just drink the juice of the apple, which again has some nutrients, but it's a far cry from that original apple. And so I always challenge people to try and get about 80% of your diet from a whole food source. So if 80% of what you eat during the day, is kind of in its original state, I like that number because it still gives you 20% to cheat and have whatever it is that you enjoy. But if you focus on that 80% rather than the 20%, focus on what are the foods you can eat that are going to give you the maximum amount of nutrients. And that, is a whole shift in looking at your diet. And so, people ask, what does that look like in a day? Well, for breakfast, rather than having your cereals, which unfortunately cereals are over here kind of in this category or maybe even a few steps further. But if instead of having, say, cereals in the morning, you're having eggs, you're having preferably eggs that you got from a farmer locally that, those eggs were the hens were pasture raised rather than fed, a diet of grains. And so, so having an egg with maybe half of an avocado or saute some spinach and cook that in with your eggs. Yeah.
I eat, this is probably totally something horrible that I think is good, but that's the problem is a lot of the things we think are good
Yeah.
end up being terrible. For cage-free egg whites, liquid egg whites though, in the carton, are those bad?
Yeah. So the question was about cage-free egg whites. And you bring up a really good topic because that's one thing that's gotten a little bit tricky in our modern world. Since more people are becoming aware of what they're eating, branding of certain things is kind of tricky, and eggs are a big one. And so cage-free, all that means is farmers have to open up the door to let their chickens out at least 5 minutes a day. Now, the chickens don't have to go outside. They don't have to go outside of their cage. They just have to be given the option. And unfortunately, with a lot of kind of modern farming practices, most chickens are given hormones and they're so large that they can't even carry their own weight. So most chickens don't go outside and kind of roam around. So cage-free doesn't mean a whole lot when it comes to, I wouldn't pay a whole lot more for cage-free eggs. What you do want to look for is pasture-raised eggs. And what's interesting about that is, and you do want to eat the whole egg because egg yolks have all of the good fats in them. And it's the good fats that are really going to keep your hunger at bay longer. If you're just doing the egg whites, the whites are a really great source of protein, but what we'll talk about here in a little bit is protein can be broken down for energy. It's just not a great source of immediate energy. So a lot of times if you're only eating a real high protein diet, that isn't for a lot of people real satisfying. So, I definitely encourage do the pasture-raised eggs, and when you do, definitely eat the yolk because one of the biggest differences you'll notice is the yolk will be bright yellow. Like it'll be a bright yellow, almost an orangish yellow compared to if you just buy regular eggs, it's like the yolk is like a pale, pale sort of yellow color. But it's that rich color that are all the phytonutrients of, the different things that the chicken's eating, from the pasture. And it's all the richness of the omega oils that we'll talk about here in just a second. And so eggs are one of those things, again, I encourage finding somebody locally. There are so many different people that raise chickens, and most of the time it's actually cheaper to do it that way, or cheaper, about the same price as buying them at the grocery store. But that is your best option when it comes to eggs. And we'll talk about here in just a second, omega-6s versus omega-3s. And I will say this, I don't take fish oil, and this will make more sense here in a second, but I have a really good omega-3 to 6 ratio. And I wholly attribute it to the fact that we do the pasture-raised eggs. And my kids, my family and I, we go through probably about 2 dozen a week. So we do a ton of eggs. And so we're getting a lot of the good omega-3s that we need in our diet from the eggs. So. No, I know. The only limit is if you've got a food allergy to eggs. But otherwise, I would not limit eggs. The dietary cholesterol you get has very little impact on the cholesterol levels in your blood. The cholesterol levels in your blood are more of a reflection of your liver function than they are of what you're eating. So, did you have a question? Organic, yeah. Okay, so the question was normal produce versus organic. And that's a really, really great question. I actually have a section, we'll talk about that here in just a second, because I do think it makes a really big difference. And so now I will say, eating whole foods doesn't mean you have to buy it all fresh. You can get great, organic frozen vegetables. I wouldn't do the canned vegetables, but organic, sometimes the frozen can even be more nutrient dense because they pick those vegetables closer to the time when they're ripe. A lot of the vegetables we get at the grocery store, because they're coming in from South America, they pick them when they're not ripe. And then as soon as they get to the grocery store, they'll spray kind of this ethylene gas to make them look ripe, but they don't have the nutrient content of a vegetable that was ripened, say, on the vine. So sometimes, frozen is not a bad option. And so, again, of course, the best option is to grow your own garden in your backyard. That's, exactly what you're getting. Next best option would be to find like a community-sponsored co-op. So there's a lot of different co-ops, especially here in Wichita. There's one called Homegrown. There's Bountiful Baskets is another one. And both, those are, you basically buy into the co-op and you get a big box of vegetables every week, and you don't necessarily get to pick what's in your box, but it's kind of whatever's in season. But that's a great way, get to know the farmers, get fresh produce, and you're supporting locally here, businesses. So like I said, 80%, if you can get 80 to 90% of your diet from a whole food source, so that, again, for breakfast is eggs, it's smoothies, whole fruit and vegetable smoothies. Lunch, it's salads, it's lettuce wraps or smoothies again. Dinner, it's protein with vegetables, good complex carbohydrates like sweet potatoes. Where you'll find most of your whole foods is when you walk the perimeter of your grocery store. So as soon as you start going in the middle aisles, that's where you get into dangerous territory, and there's not a lot of great whole food choices in the middle aisles. Excuse me. All right, so apologize for the biochemistry here up front. Those of you who know me, I'm a big nerd, and so I like to put this up here, just not that you have to fully understand this, but this is what goes on in my brain when I think about people's diet and what foods we recommend. So just to kind of orient you, what you're looking at here is a diagram of both omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. And most people by now have heard of omega-3s. We typically think of fish oil. We think of fish as being high in omega-3s, which is true. Fish oil is probably one of the best sources of omega-3s. There are plant-based sources of omega-3s, so flaxseed oil, chia seeds, walnut, your grass-fed meat. So they've actually shown that in the fat of cows that are pasture-raised, pasture-finished, they have a much higher content of omega-3s versus corn-fed meat, corn-fed livestock. Hemp seeds are another great plant-based source of omega-3s. Now, your omega-6s, most people haven't heard as much about these. These are oils that are high in plants. So stuff like corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, dairy, especially cows that have been fed a corn-based diet, all of those are high in omega-6s. And so when you look at this diagram, if you take omega-6s, which again, if you're eating a lot of foods that are high in these oils, which does anybody know what are the foods that are highest in some of these oils? All our processed foods. Yeah. Yeah, your chips. Yeah, walk down the chip aisle, walk down the cracker aisle, start looking at the ingredients, and you'll find these oils all day long. And the reason they use these a lot in processed foods is these are very shelf-stable oils, so the foods will last longer on the shelf, and they are flavorless, and, they're cheap. These are a lot of the crops that are subsidized by our government, so they are, quote, cheap to use. And so when you have a lot of omega-6 fatty acids in your diet, both of these, 6s and 3s, they are known as essential fatty acids. And they're called essential because we have to get these in our diet. We cannot make omega-3s, without eating the foods, that contain them. So these are essential things that we have to get in our diet. So when we eat, for instance, omega-3 fatty acids in all the processed foods or the fast food that we're eating, those fats go through this conversion process. They get turned into something called arachidonic acid, which gets turned into these two guys right here. These are prostaglandins and leukotrienes. You don't need to worry about that. All you need to know is that these are the cells that turn on inflammation. They are pro-inflammatory. So the more of these you have floating around in your system, the easier it's going to be to trigger a fire, to trigger an inflammatory fire. So now the flip side is when you look at omega-3 fatty acids, these fatty acids go through this conversion process into EPA and DHA, which get converted into, again, prostaglandins and leukotrienes, but these are anti-inflammatory. So these are the guys, these are kind of like the firefighters. These put out the fire. So again, if we go back to, that diagram with inflammation, we want balance. So with this diagram, even though I have omega-6s, kind of circled in red, don't mean to demonize omega-6s because they are essential and they are necessary in our diet. But the reason these have become so bad in our modern world is we way over-consume them. So we are getting way more omega-6s than omega-3s. And because of that, we have way more of these pro-inflammatory cells, floating around than we do of these anti-inflammatory cells, which turn off inflammation. So ideally, in a perfect world, we'd be getting equal amounts of omega-3s and omega-6s so that we'd be making equal amounts of these guys on this side, these anti-inflammatory ones, as well as the pro-inflammatory ones. So like I said, in today's world, because we are eating so many processed foods that are high in these oils, I would say on average, most of the patients I see, their omega-6 to 3 ratio is about 20 to 1. So for every one omega-3 fatty acid they have, they've got 20 omega-6s. And that's just average. I've seen patients that have, a 60 to 1 ratio, 75 to 1. I've seen really, really high ratios. This is something that we do test, in people's blood is their ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. And like I said, ideally you want this number as close to 1-to-1 as possible. And that's what I was referring to just a little bit ago when I was talking about the grass-fed eggs. Again, in our family, we go through a lot of grass-fed eggs, and my most recent number was 5-to-1. So I had a 5-to-1, which is I still have more omega-6s than omega-3s, but I was at that ratio not taking any fish oil. And we don't eat a lot of fish because we live in Kansas. And so a lot of that is the fact that we do a lot of grass-fed eggs. We do a lot of grass-fed meat, and we do a lot of nuts and seeds in our house. Question? Yeah.
So where is this rich Irish butter?
Okay, so the question is, where's the rich Irish butter, the Kerrygold? So butter is, so the grass-fed butter would fall in line with here, this grass-fed meat. So butter is mostly the fat from the milk of the cow. So when you have a cow that's been grass-fed, that butter is going to be much richer in omega-3 fatty acids versus if you're getting that milk from a cow that's been corn-fed. Again, corn is real high in omega-6s. And so if you're force-feeding a cow corn, which they were not designed to be able to adequately digest, then they're going to store a lot of that excess omega-6 in their fat. So that means more omega-6s in the milk and more omega-6s in that nice marbling that we all love, on a juicy steak. And so, so you want to definitely choose grass-fed as much as possible. And as another side note, we were talking about reflux in humans. So cows, interestingly enough, the highest amount of calcium carbonate in the world is actually used in the feed of cows because calcium carbonate is a buffering agent. So because we are feeding cows this really high corn-fed, grain-fed diet, cows were not made to adequately digest that. So that's creating reflux symptoms in cows. But unlike humans, when they get reflux, they stop eating. So to prevent that, farmers will preemptively put calcium carbonate in their feed so that will dampen down the acid, which means they're not digesting their food as well either. Because so they'll put the calcium carbonate in to decrease that symptom of reflux because they're feeding cows a diet they weren't designed to eat. And again, this is so crazy. So do you guys know one of the highest sources of emission rates in our world today? The whole ozone, gas, it's not coming from cars. It's coming from cows. It's the gas that cows are passing. That methane gas is a significant contributor to global warming. And it's like, well, yeah, if we're feeding them a diet of grains that they can't digest, and we're feeding them calcium carbonate so that they'll eat more of it, and then on top of that, they're eating all these grains, and the reason farmers feed them these grains is so that they'll put on more weight. I mean, it's like, hello, obesity, global warming, like everything, all reflux, all in one. It's like if we use our cows as a micro study, we should be looking at ourselves and be like, should we be eating grains? Should we be, using all the different, chemicals, the steroids, the antibiotics, everything they use in cows? It's like, well, look how sick they are. Did you have a question?
So do they do all that with cows because it's cheaper than grass feeding them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's cheaper. So documentary for this is Food Inc., which I think it's still free on Netflix. If you've got Netflix, watch Food Inc. It will change your perspective on not only from a cruelty issue of how they're treating the animals, like which that right there is an issue in and of itself. But I mean, yeah, it's cheaper to do it this way. They're mass producing meat, which again, you have to look at this problem, because I don't think the farmers or even the big corporations are totally the only ones to blame. Part of it is us too. As consumers, we demand as much for as little as possible. We want the most bang for our buck. And in fact, when you look at what the average American spends on food, even though it seems like we're spending a lot, we are actually spending less than what they used to spend back in the 50s and 60s. And so, but we're spending a whole lot more on our healthcare than they did back in the 50s and 60s. So kind of go figure there. But part of shifting this whole environment of our food industry is how we spend our food dollars. So the big companies are going to follow suit. If we are demanding, pasture raised cows, if we're not eating as much meat, that's actually one answer. I heard a story on NPR that one of the answers to global warming they came up with was if people just cut their meat consumption in half. And yeah, and not even everybody, it's just the highest consumers. There's a whole percentage of the population that are the highest consumers of meat. And if just that percentage cut what they ate in half, it would have a significant impact on global warming. And so we're partly to blame because we have this demand for cheap food and we want it when we want it. I'm guilty of this too. I always tell the story about last fall, I went into the grocery store and I had a recipe in mind and I needed summer squash for my recipe. And I go in the store and there was no summer squash. And I was really irritated. I'm like, why don't they have summer? It's like, it's fall. It's not summer. Like, it's not in season. Like, they shouldn't be expected. But in our minds, that's kind of what we've been accustomed to, is just to have things when we want them any time of year. And we're part of the problem with all of this too. So like I said, I think one of the best things is to use your food dollars kind of as a vote, so if you start, supporting more local farmers, doing more local produce, choosing more organics, these big companies will follow where the dollars go. And they already are. There's a lot of big changes, I think, that have been happening kind of grassroots up to this point, which are really, really positive changes. But we still, I think, have a ways to go with it. Yeah.
So I eat a lot of edamame because I read that that's healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So does that have soybean oil in it?
It's not. If you look at the package, it's not a significant amount of like fat. Like if you like edamame doesn't have like if you're just eating it whole, you're not going to get a significant amount of omega-6s in there. So it's not. I wouldn't stress about that too much. Yeah.
What about, like I eat the eggs and the kefir,
Mm-hmm.
and avocado. Is that saturated fat when you do that?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. So the question is eating avocado and, kefir and all that, the saturated fats in that, is that going to build up? And, even saturated fats are another one that have gotten a bad rap over the years, that they're kind of going back and saying, well, not as bad as we thought they were. So it really depends on your source of it. And it really more depends upon kind of the inflammatory status of your body. And so if you're getting those from a whole food source, that, like a grass-fed source for that dairy, I wouldn't be concerned about it. So now, one really, really cool example of food truly as medicine is I have highlighted here on this chart, there's one enzyme right here highlighted in blue called cyclooxygenase. And you'll see it's actually on both sides of the graph under the omega-6s and the omega-3s. So this enzyme right here is really, really interesting because when you look at certain drugs in a category called NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, Advil, Tylenol, the other name for some of those drugs is they're called COX inhibitors. And the reason they're called COX inhibitors is the way that those drugs get rid of your pain is they knock out this cyclooxygenase enzyme, this COX enzyme. So when you knock out that enzyme and you knock out production of this prostaglandin, this pro-inflammatory prostaglandin, you're going to decrease pain, which is great. You're going to decrease inflammation. But what's amazing is you can have that same effect by not eating so many omega-6s and not making as much of this prostaglandin, or better yet, by getting more omega-3s in your diet and making more of the opposite side, that is anti-inflammatory. Because when you take those drugs long term, you're not only affecting the omega-6 side, you're also affecting the omega-3 side. So long term, that's part of the reason why, some of those drugs can create inflammation in the lining of the stomach and of the digestive tract. They have negative side effects used long term because they're not just affecting this enzyme on the omega-6 side. So you're much better off using food as medicine than you are taking a drug, and you can have the exact same effect on your biochemistry. So, any questions about that before I move on? Okay, so third thing we're talking about here, again, first thing was whole foods, how whole foods connect with inflammation. Second thing was looking at omega-6s and 3s. The third thing that we're going to connect in our diet that is a big contributor to inflammation is our blood sugar levels. And blood sugar levels in the body are affected by the foods that we eat. So certain foods that are high on the glycemic index are going to have this sort of an effect. You see this graph here that looks like a roller coaster ride. So that high glycemic foods, basically all the foods that taste really good to us, so sugar, white potatoes, white rice, white flour, all of those are high glycemic foods. But when we eat those foods, it causes our blood sugar to spike, versus low glycemic foods kind of take our blood sugar on this other curve that's a little bit more of a stable curve. And so low glycemic foods are foods like protein, fats, high fiber foods like vegetables. Those are kind of more low glycemic. And so what's actually physiologically happening in the body when you have these high glycemic foods is, for instance, if I were to eat a big spoonful of sugar right now, table sugar is made up of what's called a disaccharide molecule. It's basically two molecules hooked together. So it's basically just one bond that holds those molecules together. So when that sugar gets down into my stomach and those bonds get broken, it's like one break and boom, you've got energy. So that's a very quick source of energy for the body. So that quick source of energy, what happens is that energy or that glucose will very, very quickly get into your bloodstream. So let's say you have, those couple spoonfuls of sugar, and what's going to happen is that sugar is going to very, very quickly build up in the blood. It's going to elevate your blood sugar. Now, the body doesn't like a high blood sugar because the more sugar you have in your blood, the thicker it gets. And the thicker it gets, the harder it is to pump, especially in like your smaller capillaries in your eyes and your fingertips, in your toes. So the body doesn't like that. So to respond to that high blood sugar, the body's going to release a hormone called insulin. And insulin is critically important because that sugar that's floating around in your bloodstream, it can't go anywhere in the body without insulin. So insulin comes along, it grabs that sugar and it puts it into your cells. So it puts it into your skin cells, your muscle cells, your liver cells. Every cell in your body is dependent upon insulin to take sugar from the blood and put it into the cells. If we didn't have insulin, sugar would just float around in the bloodstream all day long. It wouldn't go anywhere. So what happens on this curve is as it's increasing right here, that's when the sugar is building up in the blood. And then when you hit this top point, this is when insulin starts kicking in. And so insulin starts frenetically grabbing all that sugar from the blood and stuffing it, in our cells. And so what happens then is you see the blood sugar come down, which is what the body wants. But because you had such a sharp increase in blood sugar, the body dumped a lot of insulin. So because it dumped a lot of insulin, you see this sharp decrease in blood sugar. So that you can see here at the hour mark, your blood sugar is already back down, almost to a fasting level. And then at the hour and a half mark, you dip down low. And that's actually what's called hypoglycemia. So if you've ever been hangry, if you've ever been like irritable or shaky, or you get a headache, or you get so hungry that it's like you would literally eat anything that anybody put in front of you, that's your blood sugar dropping. And that's your body kind of freaking out because it doesn't know when it's going to get its next amount of sugar. So, so this sort of high glycemic, this roller coaster sort of a curve is a really unhealthy state to be in, because not only are you stressing, the body, the pancreas to release all that insulin, but you are not staying full for very long, an hour and a half after you ate, you're wanting more food. And then also every time you dip down low right here, when you go hypoglycemic, your body will release cortisol to help you compensate for that low blood sugar. And so cortisol is one of our stress hormones. So I've seen many, many patients that are in a state of adrenal fatigue, or they're really, really tired all the time, or they describe themselves as wired and tired, to where it's like you're so, so much energy, almost frenetic energy, but then it's like at the same time you get to the end of the day and you're just so tired. That very, very often is this blood sugar, kind of going out of whack here. And long-term, this also leads to weight gain because, if you have, for instance, here, at this time zero, if you have, a breakfast, say, of a donut and a Starbucks drink, with 5 pumps of hazelnut, all that sugar, you're going to use that up real quickly. And then an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you're going to be hungry again. So you'll probably be going to the vending machine or drinking a soda or doing something to try and keep yourself, full until lunchtime. Versus if you have at that breakfast, that what we talked about, scrambled eggs with spinach or an avocado, something that's low glycemic, what's going to happen is that's going to more slowly get broken down. The body's going to more slowly release that energy so that by the time you get to lunchtime, it's like you might be a little bit hungry, but you're not going to be that hangry, frantic sort of hungry. If that makes sense. So like foods that are low glycemic, like for instance, vegetables. Vegetables are made up of carbohydrates, but unlike sugar, like sugar, remember I said it had one bond, you break that bond, you've got energy. You can think about vegetables and even a lot of fruits. The reason they're lower glycemic is they've got a whole lot of bonds. So to get that energy, rather than it's like a one snip and boom, you've got energy, it's a snip, 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 snip all along that molecule. And so it more slowly releases that energy over time. So you don't get this huge surge right here in sugar, but it's more kind of a slow release over time. Blood sugar is extremely important. This is another reason why I don't recommend cereals. Cereals tend to be high glycemic. And, again, it depends on the person. Some people are more sensitive to insulin. Look at your family history. If you've got a history of diabetes, or if you've got, family history of blood sugar dysregulation, then having cereals for breakfast is one of the worst things you can do, because you're setting yourself up to be on this roller coaster ride. Because for someone who's got a family history of diabetes, having cereal might be the same sort of blood sugar spike as, say, somebody else who has a donut. Because you just can't process those carbohydrates as well. And that's me. I lived forever, it feels like, my 20s, early 30s, where it's like I'd have breakfast, but I would be hungry all the time. It was literally, I was at that phase where it's like I'd eat something, and it was like I was already thinking about my next meal, because I was hungry all the time. And what was happening is my blood sugar was just severely dysregulated. I was a vegetarian, and so I didn't get enough protein. I wasn't eating much fat, and so I was mostly surviving on carbohydrates. And I've got a strong family history of diabetes, and carbohydrates will just throw my blood sugar off pretty significantly. And so for me, I do a lot of fasting in the mornings, which we can talk about that if anybody has questions about that. I do a lot of fasting in the mornings, and then I also do a lot of just low glycemic, sorts of meals these days. And it's amazing, because eating that way, for instance, like today, it's like teaching this through lunch, not having time to eat lunch. It's like normally, I'd be like, I wouldn't be able to focus or concentrate, but it's like not having anything. It's like my blood sugar can stay stable. And it's like right now, if there was a lunch, I would eat, and I would be hungry, but it's like not having it. It's like, I'm okay. And you can kind of, adapt. Yes. Balance out. So the question was, how long does it take the body to adapt? And, it kind of depends on the person, So some people, it can take up to 2 months to kind of build that, what we call metabolic flexibility. Some people, it only takes a couple weeks, So it just kind of depends on your body and your physiology. And so it is the way I recommend people kind of going about it is start with breakfast and try and make your breakfast as low carb as possible. Low carb and high nutrient, so make sure you have something green with your breakfast, but make it low carb, high fat, and see how you feel with that. Do that for a couple of weeks. And when you get adjusted to that, then move on to your lunch and make your lunch also as low carb as you can. And eventually you'll get into certain patterns of eating where you'll be able to tell, like if you have something to eat and an hour later you're hungry, that probably had a negative impact on your blood sugar. And so, so either the next time you eat that food, you need to pair it with something, like for instance, an apple is a great example. Apple has a lot of fiber in it. And for some people, an apple would not, have this sort of spike effect on their blood sugar. But for somebody like me, having an apple by itself would spike my blood sugar. But if I pair that apple, say, with some almond butter or a handful of almonds or something that's going to kind of help balance out some of those sugars, then it won't have that sort of, spiking effect. So it's just a lot of trial and error and figuring out what works well for you. So, yeah.
I'm having a lot of trouble with no cereal.
Yeah.
Cereal. But I do use grains, but I use whole grains,
Mm-hmm.
like brown rice,
Mm-hmm.
stone ground oatmeal, to which I've also usually added some dried fruits,
Mm-hmm.
nuts and such,
Mm-hmm.
coconut oil.
Mm-hmm.
I don't buy those commercial things that I bought when I had a child that demanded them.
Right.
Is that equally bad, though?
Yeah, so the question was certain whole grains like brown rice and oats, especially if you combine them with coconut oil, are those bad? And whole grains can be a great source of nutrients. It really depends on the individual. And so if you're having, for instance, adrenal issues, like you're having problems with sleep, or you're having problems like with your mood or irritability, or if you're getting hungry throughout the day, then I would look at that and say, maybe you're having those at the wrong time of day. Maybe having them for breakfast is having too big of an impact on your blood sugar. Maybe you need to save those and have them closer toward the end of the day, because at the end of the day, your body's more insulin sensitive. So, but it really just depends on the person, because I have a number of patients that can do oatmeal for breakfast, especially in the way you describe, where you combine it with good fats, good protein, and they're fine. They don't have that blood sugar drop. And if you don't have that, that would be a perfectly acceptable food for you. And so, yeah, and so it really depends on the individual and some of the issues that we deal with kind of one-on-one with some of our patients. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So grains can be a real important, and like I said, and not that, everybody needs to cut out grains. What we'll talk about here is you'll see kind of where grains come into the picture, and, they do have an impact on our blood sugar. But again, some people are better adapted to deal with that blood sugar fluctuation compared to others. And so it just really depends kind of on the individual. And if you're not having any problems, then if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So all right, so like I said, your high glycemic foods are going to be your white foods, your white flours, white sugars, white potatoes, juices. All of those are going to spike your blood sugar real high, versus your low glycemic foods tend to be your vegetables, whole fruits, dairy, meats, good fats. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about connecting diet with inflammation is color. So this is a look at what's called the ORAC score, oxygen radical absorbance capacity. You don't need to remember that. All that basically means is it's looking at how much color does food have, fruits and vegetables specifically have. Because the more color, the deeper, the richer the color in fruits and vegetables, the more phytonutrients they have. Because plants use these phytonutrients to help protect them from the harmful UV rays of the sun. So these phytonutrients can be real important for us to help protect us and to help keep inflammation levels low. So certain vegetables, like, of course, our leafy greens, our dark leafy greens are some of the highest ORAC score, foods. But I love beets, especially summertime. Beets are one of my favorites. Broccoli, bell peppers, all of those are going to be, rich in color. With your fruits, your berries tend to be your best bet because they have the highest amount of phytonutrients. These prunes and raisins tend to be a little bit higher in sugar, so I don't typically recommend those, or if I do in moderation. But, basically when you're looking at your dinner plate at night, there's a big difference in a plate that has white chicken, white rice, a white roll, and corn, versus a plate that's got pink salmon, sauteed greens, asparagus, and sweet potatoes. The second plate has a lot of color, and the more color on that plate, that equals nutritional value for us. And what's interesting about color is the food industry knows that we are attracted to color. And the reason we're attracted to color is because our ancestors knew the more colorful a food was, the more nutrition it had, the more nutritional value. And they didn't think nutrition, but for them, it made them feel better. And so, that's why when you look at candy's colored, to make it more visually appealing to us. Or drinks, they make drinks different colors to make it more appealing to us. And so, interestingly enough, the only color that doesn't appear very often in nature, which is why it looks really odd on our plate, is blue. So blue is not in nature very often. And I can attest to this because my kids dyed Easter eggs, and I used the hard-boiled eggs to make a salad, and some of the blue coloring had gotten through onto the eggs. And when you look at blue eggs on this pretty salad, it just looked completely out of place. And so, but historically in nature, the foods that have the richest color also have the richest nutrient value. And so I always say I love the foods that when I'm chopping them up, they stain my fingers, so like beets and, not bell peppers, but sweet potatoes, all those foods that stain your fingers have a lot. Blueberries have a lot of nutritional value. And, I'm sorry, what?
Green bell peppers, not so much.
No, green bell peppers they're great. Yeah. Interestingly enough, too, you can also, if anybody's into essential oils have an ORAC score that is off the chart. And again, I'm not an expert in essential oils, so I can't really comment beyond that. But there's a lot of antioxidant power in essential oils. Like their ORAC scores are in the 20,000s, so compared to these. So that can be a nice concentrated antioxidant source as well. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is about beets and how do you prepare beets. So my absolute two favorite ways to prepare beets are I will wash and scrub them. I don't even take the peel off, but I wash and scrub them and I will chop them up and steam them. And I will toss them then with a little bit of goat cheese. And that is by far my favorite. And it's good warm, but then it's also really good to let that cool down in the refrigerator and put it on top of a salad. So that's probably my absolute favorite way to do beets. Second favorite way is to, again, wash them, scrub them, chop them up, and then I will roast them on a pan. So I'll put some coconut oil, just a little bit of sea salt. Sometimes I'll put like a little bit of rosemary or, a little bit of basil or thyme, and then just put them in the oven at about 400 degrees for about 15 minutes. And so that's the other way. And when I do that, I'll usually mix them. I'll do beets, I'll do sweet potatoes. Sometimes I'll put some broccoli or some white potatoes, and I'll kind of make this harvest medley, So, or butternut squash is another good one in there. So, yeah. So those are, and then you can also use the greens. So if you get them fresh and you've got the beet greens on the top, save those and you can saute them and eat them kind of like Swiss chard is what I think they taste like. Swiss chard, they're a little bit denser, a little more fibrous than spinach, but you could use them in a salad, but I like to saute them and put a little bit of olive oil and salt on them. They're really good. Yeah, so olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, those are higher in what are called omega-9s. So omega-9s are going to be more along the lines of the anti-inflammatory oils, but they're a different pathway. So, but those are good. Walnut is higher in omega-3s, correct. So, but the omega-9s are just as good, so the coconut oil is great. Olive oil, I don't typically recommend cooking with it because when you heat it up, it can actually turn into a trans fat. So it's good for low heat sauteing or for drizzling after you've cooked your vegetables. Okay, so now we're kind of jumping into what I mentioned, the ancestral diet. And looking at the ancestral diet, we're going to look at where we started so we can look at what our digestive system was designed to do. And then we'll look at how things have changed and how that's affected our inflammation levels. So again, when you think of the ancestral diet, these are our hunter-gatherer cultures. They did mostly gathered, a lot of plant matter, and then when they had available, they hunted meat. And so when you look back on these people, the records we have, they rarely showed degenerative and inflammatory disease. Now, the counter argument to that is, well, their life expectancy was about 30 years old. So most of us don't have a lot of degenerative diseases before the age of 30. But interestingly enough, the unfortunate pattern I see a lot in the pediatric patients I have is that there is inflammation in kids younger. And, what's different about kids is kids make about 1 billion times more stem cells than we make as adults. And so kids are in this rapid growth, rapid healing phase of life. And so when you have inflammation in their system, inflammation could be causing, damage and breakdown, but because they heal so fast, they never feel the effects of inflammation. But the story you hear time and time again is people are like, I felt great, and then I hit 30, and then things just went downhill. That's a good sign that you were probably inflamed in your 20s, and what happened was you hit 30, once you get in your 30s, your body stops making as many stem cells, you don't make as much human growth hormone, so you just don't heal as well. And when you're not healing as well, now all of a sudden the damage that inflammation is causing is felt more so in your system. But like I said, I regularly see kids that have high markers of inflammation when they're young. And so, like I said, the only thing that changes, inflammation and arthritis is not inevitable as you age. You just have to work a lot harder the older you get to keep inflammation low. So, so when you look at the ancestral diet, at these 4 factors we talked about, our ancestors were getting 100% whole foods. So that's all they had available. There wasn't a grocery store. So their diet was 100% whole foods. They had a perfect 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s. Their glycemic index was very low because, again, they didn't have the grains. They were mostly eating vegetable matter and meat. And then their ORAC score, their color score, was very high. So they were, again, getting lots of vegetable matter. So this is what we were designed to eat and live on. This is what our digestive system was designed to process. And so when you look at that kind of in a graphic form here, you have a balance in both the anti and pro-inflammatory systems. And then all of these things that help protect us from inflammation are nice and substantial in the body. So this is what we were designed to eat as humans. So then when you start looking at the agricultural revolution, which again, agriculture and grains are not a new thing. You can look in the Bible and, they talk about ancient Egypt and the grains in Egypt. And so, and I will say this, that, the development of being able to farm was a huge evolutionary advantage for humans, because what that meant is that we could be less nomadic and more settled. So we didn't have to always chase the meat, because we could now raise our animals and, feed them grains when there wasn't pasture available. And so, so this was a huge advantage to us. But as you start to, introduce more and more grains, that starts to replace some of the vegetable matter and some of the other things we were eating. So this starts to shift us more into a pro-inflammatory state. So when you look at this agricultural revolution, which again wasn't a well-defined time period, but just kind of with the introduction of grains, you see a slight decrease in the amount of whole foods, people are eating. Omega-6 to 3 ratio is 5 to 1, so not too bad, just a slight shift more toward a pro-inflammatory state. Glycemic index, again, not as great, because grains are much higher on the glycemic index compared, even whole grains, compared to say something like, vegetables or meat. And then the ORAC score is not quite as great, because these grains have replaced some of the vegetable matter. So with this, again, just kind of a slight tip toward this pro-inflammatory state. Not too bad, though. Nothing, too serious. This is still not creating, the chronic diseases we're seeing today. But then when you start getting into what we kind of term the Industrial Revolution, and again, this isn't a well-defined time period, but I kind of think about the Industrial Revolution around the time where food became a business, where food companies started deciding, the ingredients they were going to use were based on, how long the food was going to last on the shelf, how they could sell more of it, so they wanted to make it taste really good. They wanted to make it taste really good, so we'd eat more of it. So part of that is they began refining grains and refining sugar, because the more you refine it, the better it tastes. And again, you're taking out all the things that would make it rancid on the shelf. You start separating, fats, so that, now, again, they'll last longer. It's a proprietary thing. And so, this is where, like I said, food really became a business. And again, I don't mean to discount the advantages during this time period, because whenever I talk about this, my grandma always comes to mind. My grandma's in her late 80s, and she grew up on a farm here in Kansas, 9 sisters. And I'll never forget that my husband and I were, at the time, living in Georgia, and we had a big garden. And we were growing a bunch of tomatoes and cucumbers and all this stuff. And I remember I was talking to my grandma, and I'm like, yeah, we're going to make tomato sauce, and we're going to can it, and, we're going to make salsa and all this stuff. And she just looked at me, and she was like, Annie, she's like, you can go to the grocery store and buy canned tomatoes for 99 cents. She's like, why would you go through all the trouble of growing it yourself, And it was so funny to me, because it's like, thinking back, it's like in her mind, she remembers a time where they had to do that. And so, especially for women, some of these conveniences of the grocery store were huge, to be able to allow them to have more time back in their day, that they weren't just inside preparing food or growing food all day long. And so there are a lot of advantages, but what I think has happened, is, we spent so much time where it was more about convenience, that we weren't thinking about what were some of the health effects and what are we missing. What are the nutrients we're missing in some of these foods? And now we're starting to see some of the chronic diseases pop up and the health effects. And so now, we're kind of going back and questioning, well, what are we really eating? And so, but this was kind of the beginning of, like I said, of really food becoming a business. And so during this time period, whole food consumption was about at 65%. Most people were still eating a lot of their meals at home. So this number is higher than it is today. But you start to see a big shift here in this omega-6 to 3 ratio. Now we're at kind of a 10 to 1, 10 times the amount of omega-6s, because, omega-6s are what is in the margarine and the vegetable oils that people are cooking with. They're using less from the farm. They're starting to feed their cattle, grains that make them grow bigger and faster. And so actually a really great book, if you want to read a little bit about this history, is a book called The Dorito Effect. It's by Mark Schatzinger, I think is how but just look up The Dorito Effect and you'll find it. But he talks about this whole history, and he talks about this history of post-World War II. There was this competition to see who could make the biggest chicken, because chickens, they used to, not butcher chickens until they were, I think it was like around 14 or 15 weeks. And now the average age of a chicken that's butchered is like around 6 weeks, because they figured out ways to make that chicken a whole lot bigger, a whole lot faster. But you're losing a lot of the nutrients, a lot of the flavor, you lose a lot kind of in that process. And so he talks all about that, though. Real interesting book. So during this time period, this is where we see a big shift toward a pro-inflammatory state right here. And then again, all these things that protect us from inflammation, the whole foods, the low sugar, the colors, are getting less and less in the diet as well. So that brings us to today, to our fast food revolution. Lots of processing of food, lots of manipulation of foods. Food science is an entire industry in our world today. Lot of carbohydrate intake, a lot of sugar. There's a lecture I gave probably about a year ago. It's on our YouTube page, all about sugar. And when you look at the average sugar consumption, it will blow your mind. I mean, it will absolutely blow your mind. Like the average child will consume about 45 pounds of sugar a year, which is kind of like that's their body weight in sugar. So how is it that they are consuming that much sugar? But when you start looking at, all the foods, like I gave the example of a child's lunch, peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a fruit juice, fruit cup, not even counting a dessert. You look at a meal like that, and there's added sugar in the bread, added sugar in the jelly, added sugar in the peanut butter, added sugar in the fruit, added sugar in the drink. I mean, you could easily have a meal that's got 45 grams of sugar, which is like drinking a soda. So, I mean, I reiterate over and over again, if you are not actively keeping sugar out of your diet, then it is in your diet in a really big way without you even knowing it. So I'll get off my soapbox for a second, but that's kind of a big thing. So a lot of sugar intake, refined carbohydrates, low intake of vegetables, more hydrogenated fats. So again, they're looking for the newest way to keep foods longer on the shelf. Like, have you ever looked? Like, sometimes I'm amazed at, like, I will look at like a box of cereal, or you look at a box of crackers, and like the expiration date is like 2019. It's like a year and a half away, and you're like, how could that even be possibly something I want to put in my body if it'll last that long on the shelf? What's in it? Exactly. And so one big thing, this right here, this is a really interesting thing. So natural and artificial flavorings. And I love talking about this because most people haven't heard a lot about it, but if you look on processed foods, it's in every processed food. You'll see it. It's one of the lower ingredients. But this artificial flavoring of food started in the late 70s. And Mark Schatzinger talks about this also in his book, The Dorito Effect. But artificial flavoring in food started in the late 70s when they started to figure out how they could chemically replicate flavor. So a great example of this is imitation vanilla. Has anybody ever thought about what is imitation vanilla? Imitation vanilla is essentially they broke down chemically what makes up vanilla extract, and then they replicated that with a cheaper chemical version. So when you taste imitation vanilla, it tastes like vanilla. But the biggest difference is that imitation vanilla doesn't have the healthy medicinal properties that vanilla extract has, because vanilla extract is from the vanilla seed. And so there's actually good anti-inflammatory properties to that pure vanilla extract. So when you can chemically, replicate flavor, not that the chemical itself, it's not great, but there's, that's not the bad part. Where the bad part comes in is your brain, when it thinks about flavor in food, what that attaches to in your brain is nutrients. Because in nature, when you're eating real foods, the flavor of real foods equals nutritional value. So I always give the example of a carrot. It's the carotenoids in a carrot that make it taste like a carrot, makes it taste different than an apple or, piece of broccoli. And so our brain is programmed that the more flavor, the more nutritional value. So, you cut to today where you have these like flavor blasted goldfish or 20 different flavors of Pringles, you're getting this huge blast of flavor to your brain, and your brain's like, wow, this is amazing. But the reason it tastes good is your brain thinks it's getting some sort of nutritional value. And so it's like you eat those first few Pringles, tastes really good, your brain's lighting up, but then it's like you wait a little bit and you're like, you didn't get anything. That chip that, that flavor was attached to has no nutritional value. So your brain's like, maybe I just need more of it. So it's like you eat some more, and then it's like, doesn't satisfy you. So you eat more, and then it's like, you look and like the whole can's gone. You're like, how did I do that? How did I eat the whole can? And that is, a big problem. And that's something, again, I work with a lot of kids, and I tell parents all the time, I'm like, if you're feeding your kid all these foods that have all this artificial flavoring on them, when they go to eat real food like vegetables, it's not going to taste good to them. They're used to this high level intensity of flavor, and real food just doesn't live up to that. And so that is one of the first steps. Start cutting out foods that have artificial flavorings on them. And, not that food should be bland or taste bad, but you want your food to be flavored with real spices. So even if you're going to the store and you're picking out a bag of chips, if you find a bag of like the natural chips that have coconut oil, and you see the spices are onion powder, garlic powder, real spices, those are the foods you want to be eating, because those spices do have a medicinal value to them, and they will have some anti-inflammatory effects. So you just want to use real food to flavor, real spices and herbs to flavor your food, not these artificial flavorings. Did you have a question?
I was going to say,
Yeah.
What makes me really sad that they've made those apples that are supposed to taste like grapes.
I know. Yeah.
Towards kids,
Exactly.
You need to make grapes taste sweet like cotton candy.
Yeah. No, for the people online, she said that, there's not apples that taste like grapes and vice versa. And, I honestly, again, I promise you, and if you don't believe me, anybody that has a kid or a grandkid, if you can stick it out long enough, stick it out a couple weeks, if you just give them real food, they will eat it. If you take away all that other processed junk, all of a sudden they're going to want to start eating real food, because we are born with kind of this innate intuition when it comes to food. Like, there was a really cool research study that was done by a pediatrician where, as opposed to giving babies, one single baby food, when they introduced solids, she gave them a choice of like 25 different foods. And what was amazing is, for about the first week, each of the kids kind of, sampled different types of foods. But after about a week, every single child had food preferences. So every time they'd go for certain foods, and they'd only eat, certain foods. And what they found was, when they measured their nutrient levels, those foods mirrored their nutritional needs. So there was one little boy that had rickets, which is a vitamin D deficiency. And without prompting, every single time they'd put a little cup of cod liver oil, and he'd drink that whole cup of cod liver oil, because for him, nutritionally, that's what he needed. That tasted good to him. And so I always think it's really cool when people go through this process where they start eating whole foods and real food, and they cut out all the artificial flavorings. And then all of a sudden they're like, I crave Brussels sprouts, or I crave sweet potatoes. Like, there's probably something to that. There's probably something your body is really needing in that food. And that's part of the reason why you're gravitating toward that. But we never know that if we're constantly pumping our body full of, artificially flavored, highly processed foods. So, all right. So today, this is where we're at, 35% whole foods in our diet, which I can attest. I do a lot of reviews of people's diet diaries, and there's just, this is a pretty accurate number, if even a little inflated. There are a lot of people that are not even getting 35% of their diet from a whole food source. The average omega-6 to 3 ratio is 20 to 1. And again, we measure this in all of our new patients, and this number is very accurate. And like I said, I regularly see people that are 30 to 1, 40 to 1, 60 to 1, much higher even. Glycemic index is very high. Just look at the soaring rates of diabetes in our world today. We're eating these really high glycemic foods. And, again, I strongly encourage you to go watch that sugar lecture I gave, because I talk about different types of sugars. And there's a certain type of sugar called fructose that we're getting in high amounts. And fructose when you eat fructose, that doesn't make you feel full. Like you don't feel satisfied. And it's almost kind of like your body is getting a lot of fructose that it will store as fat. Most of the fructose we eat, we actually store as fat. But as you store fructose as fat, that's not signaling to your brain to stop eating. It's almost kind of like your brain becomes blind to it. And so, that's part of the reason why people can drink the 64-ounce, big gulps of soda, which has probably 1,000 calories, worth of sugar in it, and they're still hungry after they do that because that sugar is not satisfying to them in any way. And so sugar is a really, really big issue in our world today. And like I said, I just actually myself did a cleanse about a month ago, and I don't eat a ton of sugar, but again, for the first week when I took it out, it was like my body revolted and was like, all of a sudden, it's like everything sugar I wanted. It's almost like an addiction, and so it is good to go through that process of cutting it out and eliminating it, and you just feel so much better when it's gone.
I think one of the big problems is we don't think grams.
Yeah.
And so when you know that 4 grams of sugar is equal to a teaspoon,
Mm-hmm.
so when you buy that fruit juice of 4,
Yep.
you're drinking 8 teaspoons of sugar.
Yeah. Yeah.
But until I knew that,
Yeah.
I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah, grams of sugar. It adds up really, really quickly. And I did the math. I think it was 450 grams of sugar equals a pound. And so you think about that, which 450 sounds like a lot, but that's 9 cans of soda. So 9 cans of soda and you've drank a pound of sugar pretty much. So, I mean, it does add up really, really quickly. So if you're a numbers person, the number I always give people is your liver can process 25 grams of fructose per day. Beyond 25 grams of fructose, you're going to automatically store it as fat. And so you can kind of do the math in the sense that most sugar is about 50% fructose, 50% glucose. So that means you can have a maximum of about 50 grams of sugar, which is actually a lot of sugar, but 50 grams of sugar, whether that's naturally occurring sugar or whether that's added sugar, but 50 grams total of sugar per day. Beyond that, you're going to store it as fat. So, so again, 50 grams of sugar, that's 1 can of soda. 50 grams of sugar, that's more than one, like Starbucks, one of the frou-frou drinks. 50 grams of sugar, that's 2 juice boxes. So it really does add up pretty quick. 50 grams of sugar, that's 2 Cliff Bars. So it does add up very quickly. Oh, she's got her Starbucks drink in the back. Yeah. Yeah. The Starbucks drinks tend to be the ones, the blended frappuccinos. Those tend to be your really high sugar drinks, but. The skinny vanilla latte, yeah. Well, and again, everything in moderation. And like I said, I encourage people to, if you think about things rather than, trying to avoid, think about just shooting to get 80% of your diet. Because if you can get 80% of your diet from a whole food source, the grams of sugar will naturally take care of itself, unless you're eating all fruit all day long, but for the most part, if your focus is getting real food, all this stuff I'm talking about will naturally balance out. Even omega-3s versus omega-6s. In nature, most foods have both of them in it. Like nuts and seeds are usually a pretty good balance of both omega-3s and omega-6s. So if you're eating real foods, you're eating from a good, healthy pasture-raised source, most of the stuff I'm talking about will naturally fall into place. And so you don't have to get so overwhelmed with all the details of it. So this is us today. We're 20 times more inflamed than we've ever been, and all these things that protect us from that inflammation, we're getting less and less of. So this is why we're so sick today. We are just in a perpetually inflamed state, and depending on where your weakness is in your body, that's where that inflammation tends to have, the biggest impact. And so, but by overall toning down your inflammation, you can just substantially help how you feel, and how your body works. So I presented a problem, so I like to present a solution. So these are 14 ways to eat a low inflammatory diet. And most of these we've talked about, but I just kind of condensed it into a list. And, again, I encourage people start with baby steps. All of this is so overwhelming. And as with most things, the reason why 95% of all diets fail is because people try and do this huge overhaul and they change everything and they use up all their willpower in the first week of their diet, and then things just crash. And so I always encourage pick one or two and make slow changes and just create new habits with all of these. And, you'll look back in a year and you're going to be like, wow, this is some big changes I've made. So, my number one, of course, is eat whole foods. 80% of your diet from a whole food source. And if you can do that, most of this other stuff will fall in line. Number two, eat more fish, especially cold water varieties. Those of you who have the notes packet, there's a diagram in the back that has which fish are highest in mercury. So that's one thing to be aware of. You want to, avoid the real high mercury fish. The best rule of thumb with fish is the smaller and lower on the food chain they are, the less mercury they'll have. So stuff like anchovies and sardines are going to be your biggest bang for your buck, meaning they'll have a lot of omega-3s, but they're low in stuff like mercury. So number three, grass-fed meats. Again, living on the plains, American Indians who lived on the plains did not have access to a lot of fish. And so not that we necessarily need that here. What we do need is grass-fed meat that is much higher in omega-3s. Number four, eat lots of colorful vegetables. So again, one of the things I love about co-ops and, CSAs is you get a box of vegetables and they're not necessarily the vegetables you would have picked out at the store. So it's kind of fun to learn new vegetables and try new things. And, I'm a huge fan of, trying, new recipes, on Pinterest. And actually, this is kind of fun. Breaking news. I just took over the Reardon Clinic's Pinterest page. So I am going to go nuts. I'm going to start posting a bunch of recipes. So if any of you guys are on Pinterest, look for us, the Reardon Clinic, and I'll start adding a whole bunch of my favorite, websites when it comes to different recipes. Yeah. Pork, again, pork is, people have strong opinions about pork. And I mean, as long as it is from a good, grass-fed source, it can be, a fine source of meat. A lot of it just depends on how it's raised. And so, I think you can pasture raise. That's a good question. I don't know enough about farming. So there is, what's interesting is in the movie Food Inc., they interview a guy named, what's his name? Joel Salinger, I think is his name. But he has he has a farm called Polyface Farms, and he has this whole farming practice where it's like you rotate the crops and like the cows eat the grass, but then you move them to the next field and you put the chickens, and the chickens will eat the worms out of the cow poop, and the cow poop fertilizes. So it's this whole system, and I don't know where pigs fall into that, but I think they're part of that system somewhere. And so, but yeah, I mean, you can find pasture raised, whatever that is that they eat on the pasture. I'm not sure though. Sorry. It's a really good question. Okay, so number 5, use spices and herbs to flavor your food. Summer's a great time. Grow a little herb garden. You can, get to some potted plants and grow some herbs. And it is my absolute favorite thing in the summertime just to pick like fresh basil and throw it in with my spinach salad, or have fresh chives that you chop up and put in a dressing. And it's really easy to do, especially in the summertime. And that is what, it's the fresh spices and herbs and the fresh ingredients. That is what takes your food from being normal to being like gourmet. That's the secret of gourmet cooking is, they use a lot of fresh ingredients. And so, herbs and spices are a great addition to that. Your cooking oils, coconut oil is probably your best for high heat. Olive oil is fine for low heat cooking. But avocado oil is great. Walnut oil is great. There's a lot of different sesame seed oil. It has a strong flavor, but that's another good high heat oil. Number 7, avoid food sensitivities and allergies. And so, again, coconut oil might be a great oil, but if you have an allergic reaction to it, it's not going to be great for you because food allergies can create an inflammatory response. And so that's kind of a whole nother conversation, but definitely an important one, to kind of be aware of what foods, you react to. Number 8, avoid, the vegetable oils. So again, all your fast food is going to be cooked in these vegetable oils. You can still, frying food, you can still fry food in, say, like coconut oil. Not that, when you high heat food, you tend to destroy the nutrients a little bit more compared to other forms of cooking, but it's not necessarily the frying of the food that's horrible. It's a lot of times it's the oil that they're using. Limit refined sugars or avoid refined sugars. Again, when you're eating 80% whole foods, that will pretty well naturally take care of a lot of those refined sugars. Limit refined grains. I'm a huge fan of going gluten-free, but I find just as often as wheat is a problem, corn's a problem. So again, that kind of goes back to your food sensitivities and what you can handle. Limit dairy. So dairy is one of those that, again, we have a limited amount of lactase to break down dairy proteins, but we don't make a lot of it, because we're not baby cows. So, most people, their problem with dairy is they way overdo it. So a little bit of cheese as a garnish, might not be the worst thing, but I don't have parents start their kids on cow's milk. I don't recommend drinking cow's milk because that's just a lot of dairy all at once. And most of our dairy, most of our milk has been pasteurized and homogenized, and 80% of antibiotics in our world are used on livestock. So there's a passive amount of antibiotics and estrogens. Like, it always amazes me that doctors, when kids have problems, like for instance, when girls start developing too young, or there's growth issues, one of the first things pediatricians will say is, "Oh, stop drinking cow's milk," because it's full of some of these growth hormones. And so it's like, how is that okay for any child to drink? But I've had a number of patients that their pediatrician has said, switch them to a different form of milk. We have this limited idea that it's like we can only get calcium from cow's milk. Well, vegetables have calcium in them. And in fact, really, calcium is one of the least problematic minerals. I more often than not find kids have a magnesium deficiency or a zinc deficiency. Calcium is usually fine. And so I'm not a big fan of cow's milk, and for a lot of parents, I actually just recommend they do water with their kids. You can do almond milk or rice milk or coconut milk, but really just training your kids to drink water is your best bet. So number 12, number 12, snack on nuts and seeds. Those are great, low glycemic, high good fat, high fiber snack. They're real portable. They're a great snack option. When you're thirsty, drink water. Just cutting out the Powerades, the Gatorades, the sodas. You can cut out a huge amount of sugar and calories, from your diet. Plus, you'll feel a whole lot better. And then number 14, eat organically raised foods. And this is something that is a good kind of segue. I used to kind of have just this one slide, and I would kind of comment on, how, organic foods have more nutritional value. So you definitely want to do organic foods. And I would always say, too, that there's kind of this association between some chronic diseases and pesticides, but there's no kind of direct correlation. But I started digging into this subject a few months back, and the more research I did on it, it just kind of blew my mind. And so I'll let some of this research speak for itself. And, again, there hasn't been a landmark study looking at all of this. And part of that, I wonder if it isn't political. But if you look at, which I'll come back to this, I'll come back to these in just a second. Oh, no, this is an old version of this PowerPoint. Let me see. Here it is. Here we go. Okay. So when you look at the use of Roundup, so Roundup is the herbicide, also known as glyphosate. So if you look at when Monsanto introduced what they call Roundup Ready crops. So Roundup Ready crops were a whole set of genetically altered crops that were resistant to this herbicide, meaning you could spray a whole lot more Roundup on the corn or the wheat, and it wouldn't kill the plant itself, but it would kill all the weeds and kill the bugs. So it would kill the bad things, but wouldn't kill the plants because they made these plants resistant to this particular chemical. So up to that point, they had been using Roundup, some, but again, in lower amounts because, if they used too much, they'd kill the plant. So around the mid-90s, this is when Monsanto introduced Roundup Ready crops. So you can see after the mid-90s how the use of Roundup skyrocketed, more than tripled, over the course of, and this just goes through 2010. So keep that in mind as we look through these next few slides. So when you look at the rates of obesity, when you look at this, here's your mid-90s. Again, you're seeing kind of a steady increase, but right here, mid-90s, look at what happens. It shoots up. Like, I am convinced more and more our obesity epidemic, yes, we do eat too much sugar, and yes, we don't eat the right foods, but the sheer fact that our obesity has skyrocketed the way it has in such a short amount of time, it can't just be our diet, because you had this whole history of from the 50s, 60s, all the way through here where people were still eating a lot of sugar. Even in the 80s, this is when the American Heart Association was like, cut out fat, so sugar became a lot more prevalent in the diet. Even during that time period, we didn't see huge spikes in obesity, but right around the mid-90s, this is where you see this huge increase in the rate of obesity. Autism, same thing. You look at mid-90s, right here is where you see this dramatic increase. Went from about 1 in 10,000 kids, now it's about 1 in 60 kids are diagnosed with autism. Dementia, again, look at during the 80s, you're seeing a steady increase, but then mid-90s, post-mid-90s, boom, you see this huge increase of dementia. Hypertension, same thing, mid-90s, huge increase. Leukemia, again, same thing, right around the same time period, huge increase. Parkinson's disease, same thing, huge increase, mid-90s. Stroke, same thing, steady increase, and then boom. Thyroid cancer, same thing, slow increase, and then it spikes. So again, there hasn't been one study that connects all these, but the one thing that does connect all of those conditions that there has been quite a bit of research on is our microbiome. It's our bacteria. And when you look at glyphosate, one of the big reasons it was passed through the FDA was they said it doesn't affect human cells because the biochemical pathway called the shikimate pathway that this chemical affects, humans don't have that biochemical pathway. So this is going to pass right through humans and it's not going to affect them, which is accurate. But what they didn't take into account and what they didn't probably really know back then was how big of an influence our microbiome and our bacterial system had on us. And bacteria do have that biochemical pathway. So when we get high amounts of glyphosate, and I need to add a slide. I just saw this a presentation, and he showed this slide of the cells that line our digestive tract, and exposed to glyphosate, that creates this environment of inflammation and leaky gut. So to answer your question, I am becoming more and more and more a huge proponent of organics, and also a more and more huge proponent of making sure you're getting enough of the good bacteria. So enough fermented foods. For the patients I see, we do high doses of probiotics. So there's definitely an impact that these chemicals are having, and my opinion is I think it's connected with our gut flora, and that's one of the biggest impacts we're seeing, because all those conditions also, it's either GI system related or it's brain related, and the brain is our gut is the second brain, so when you start affecting the bacteria, you have strong impact on brain function. So anyways, step off my soapbox, and this is a list I like to give people. This is called the Dirty Dozen. So if it's not in your budget to eat totally organic, these are the 12 worst, dirtiest foods when it comes to pesticides. So I've read the statistic, if you ate just these 12 foods organic, you'd cut out the majority of pesticides you're exposed to. Not all of them, but these are the most important ones to buy organic. And all of these are pretty readily available, not only at Dillon's, but at Walmart and Target. A lot of these foods are becoming more and more available organic. This is the Clean 15. So these are some of the ones that if it's not in the budget, these are pretty clean as far as pesticides go. So it might not be worth your money to buy these organic. Yeah, banana I think is on the clean. If not, it's pretty close. This list is actually put out by a group. It's called, if you look at ewg.org, so Environmental Working Group is their name, and they put out a list. It's about 60 different foods. So the Dirty Dozen are the 12 worst, and the Clean 15 are the 15 best. But there's a whole list of all the other fruits and vegetables and where they fall on that list. This is a great, especially going into summer, this is a really great resource. And we're actually having a lecture coming up in May where I'll be talking a lot about some of the information that's on their website, because summer is a time where we get exposed to a lot of chemicals in our sunscreens and our makeups and lotions and all these different things. And so we'll be talking about that in summertime, how you can avoid a lot of those chemicals. And this website, ewg.org, is a great resource. They actually have on your phone, you can download an app, so cool. I think it's called Skin Deep, where you can take it with you to say, like if you're going shopping for cosmetics, you can scan the barcode of that cosmetic, and if it's in their database, it will pop up with a score of how toxic that product is, and if it is toxic, what are the chemicals in it that are toxic. And so it's a really, really cool, kind of scarily cool app. You can learn a lot. Let's put it that way. And I'll say for myself, this has only been probably within the past year, I've started making a lot more of the beauty products that I use. And the thing that probably amazes me the most is how well they work. Like you typically think, you can't be using apple cider vinegar and witch hazel and it's going to work better than the, big buck stuff, but it does. It works really well. So, okay, I apologize. We're running out of time, so I'm going to kind of scoot through some of this stuff quickly. I apologize. This usually happens. But we're kind of moving into the second section here, talking about leaky gut. And, really everything we covered in the first part of this class is all just kind of compounding into this. Because, a lot of the food we eat, the first step it goes to is the digestive system. That's one of the first places it gets affected when there's a lot of, poor quality food or chemicals in our food. And so, again, it goes back to the gut we have is not designed for the world that we live in. Apart from the fact that we're eating a lot of processed foods, we're overusing antibiotics. There's a lot of GMO foods, a lot of toxic chemicals, a lot of preserved, packaged sorts of foods. So when you think about leaky gut, a lot of times the symptoms people think about are related to the GI system. So constipation, diarrhea, heartburn, gas, bloating, burping. But just as prevalent as that are migraines, mood disorders. I see this so often. Depression and anxiety. When people say to me, I feel anxious or I feel depressed, but I don't have a reason to feel that way, I first start thinking gut issues. Weight gain, weight loss, skin issues. 99% of the eczema cases I see, it's related to the gut. Most often it's a food, that people are eating a food trigger. So ADD, ADHD, brain fog, joint pain, muscle pain, fatigue, allergies, all of these are connected with the foods that we're eating. So I kind of mentioned the microbiome earlier. Most of that bacteria is in our colon, but really those cells are not only in our colon, they're in our nasal passages, they're on our skin. We're actually emitting a cloud of bacteria right now. And so kind of like Pigpen, on Peanuts, we all have this cloud of bacteria, and these bacterial cells outnumber our own cells 10-1. So we're actually made up more of bacteria than we are of our own cells. So this bacterial system plays a big role, and we're just scratching the surface of what this bacteria does. We don't even know all the things. We do know when this system gets dysregulated, people are at a much higher risk for obesity and dementia and autism. There are a lot of conditions we have connected back to this. So certain things that are destroying that system, of course, antibiotics, that's like dropping an atomic bomb. So if you take a prescription of antibiotics, of course that will affect your gut flora, but also the passive antibiotics you get in the meat and dairy. Like I mentioned, 80% of antibiotics are used on livestock in our country. So we get a passive amount of antibiotics through these foods that we're eating. Artificial sweeteners. Sorry, here's your artificial sweetener. Like Splenda, aspartame, sucralose, all of those, the no sugar sorts of foods, will kill your gut flora. So one package of Splenda will knock out about half your gut flora. So, that's part of the reason why long term, they've done studies comparing women who drink diet soda compared to women who drink regular soda. In long term, the diet sodas end up with 30% more visceral fat. So the bad fat that packs in around your organ, you'll actually end up with more weight, and especially the bad type of fat, having these artificial sweeteners. So these are just kind of, the best thing is to just train yourself to try and not need, this real sweet drinks. But one good alternative, there's a brand called Zevia. It's a soda that's sweetened with stevia. We actually have it upstairs if you wanted to try one. But that one is, since it's sweetened with stevia, stevia does not have an impact on your gut flora. Do you have a question?
I was just going to ask, this is kind of doesn't apply to everybody, but long-term use of birth control?
Yeah, so the question is long-term use of birth control. Birth control, when you look at the liver having to process and break down birth control, you're actually stealing a lot of critical nutrients to be able to do that. So a lot of B vitamins, a lot of minerals get used up trying to process those estrogens. And so it just depends on the individual, and how well, some women have great detox systems, and so birth control might not be, horrible for them, but other people who have more sluggish detox systems, birth control might affect them more. And so for sure, if you're taking it, I definitely recommend getting on, a really good multivitamin with the right types of B vitamins so you can support your body through that. So now certain chemicals also destroy your gut flora. So certain chemicals like chlorine, fluoride, pesticides, herbicides, those things they're putting in our water, the fluoride, chlorine is in our water, which is, again, it's a good thing in our water because it kills the bacteria. But if that chlorine doesn't totally get filtered out, it can have an impact on our gut flora. Stress, when you're under stress, your body is going to shunt blood away from your digestive system. So if you are chronically under stress, you're not going to be digesting your food as well. So how you build up this system, fermented foods are one of the best ways, incorporating these fermented foods into your diet. So certain things like yogurt, of course, the no sugar added yogurt, kefir, fermented sauerkraut, kombucha is one of my favorites. It's a fermented tea drink. Miso, tempeh, apple cider vinegar is fermented. So just incorporating, a different variety of fermented foods can be a great way of replenishing that good bacteria. Of course, taking a probiotic supplement, again, I used to, recommend a good maintenance dose of about 10 billion. Now my maintenance dose is closer to 50 to 60 billion, just because, again, just the world we live in, and everybody's different, so consult your provider before, increasing your probiotics. But that's what I find most people need, is a lot more than what we're getting. Now, just as important as getting the good bacteria is you've got to feed that bacteria. And what feeds the bacteria and keeps that ecosystem thriving is fiber. So fiber is what's known as prebiotic fiber. And so your best source of prebiotic fiber is in foods, especially, some of these vegetables. So having a richly plant-based diet is going to help your microbiome inherently because you'll be feeding that bacteria. So I apologize, I'm going to have to kind of skip through some of this stuff just because we're already at 1:30 here. So when you look at leaky gut, what exactly is happening in the digestive tract? This is a cross-section of your small intestine. And remember, when we talked about digestion, small intestine was where we absorb all the nutrients. So basically, this is a zoomed-in picture of that small intestine. So food is going to be floating by right here in the lumen of the small intestine, and anything that the body absorbs should have to go through. It gets absorbed across the lining of these little hairs right here, and it goes through that cell into the bloodstream. That way the body has complete control over what gets through into the bloodstream. Now, when you start having leaky gut, what happens is these proteins right here that connect these cells start to break down. And when these proteins start to break down and you get spaces in between your cells, now all of a sudden those food particles that are floating by, rather than going through that cell, are now making their way in between in these gaps. So for instance, if you have undigested corn, because you have low stomach acid, if that's partially undigested, if you were over here, that would never make its way into your bloodstream. But when you've got leaky gut and you've got space now in between, that partially digested corn protein can make its way through. And because once it hits the bloodstream, because the immune system doesn't recognize that, it attacks it and it tags it. So it creates a food sensitivity, it creates a food allergy to that protein. And over and over again, the body starts making more and more antibodies, and that's what's tested when you have a food allergy test done. So, but a lot of people, like chronically long-term, have this leaky gut. Now, you can also get autoimmunity where you actually are destroying these cells, and that's more serious, more serious digestive issues. But this is kind of what leaky gut looks like, is when these proteins start to break down, and chronically you've got a leaky and inflamed gut. Because what's amazing in these cells, there's only one cell layer thick that protects you from the food that's in your digestive tract and your bloodstream. And these cells are always being replaced. So every 5 to 7 days, all of these cells that line your digestive tract will be replaced. So pretty much every week you have a whole new lining to your digestive tract. So there's a high nutrient requirement for that, to be able to maintain a healthy system. Okay, so I'm going to kind of zoom ahead here. Certain things that cause those proteins to break down. Gliadin, it's a protein in gluten. So whether you're celiac or not, whether you react to wheat or not, you're going to be creating more inflammation in your gut when you eat wheat. That's just what the research says. Stress, like I mentioned, is going to impact the lining of your gut. Probably the two biggest things I see are dysbiosis and candida overgrowth. So what that means is you've got the wrong bacteria that's existing in your digestive tract, and that wrong bacteria is creating, just an environment of inflammation, which is kind of a chronic leaky gut scenario. I also see a lot of candida overgrowth, which candida is what's known as an opportunistic pathogen. So everybody has candida, but for some people that candida, it's like a weed that starts overpowering all your other plants. And so when that candida grows out of control, it can create a lot of issues. All right, so I'm going to kind of zoom through some of this here because we're running out of time. So how do we heal the gut? And really, kind of the final notes I'll say, healing the gut, one of the most, everybody's a little bit different. Of course, my disclaimer here. Everybody's different, and there's no kind of one size fits all. But this is kind of the 4 steps people go through when you start looking at healing the gut. Remove, replace, reinoculate, and repair. And by far, in my mind, one of the most important steps in this process is step number 1, remove, which that has been the whole class up to this point. Everything we've talked about, all the foods we've talked about that we shouldn't be having versus the foods we should be having, I would say for at least 50% of people who have issues, all they have to do is step number 1, and that will take care of their issues, their symptoms. Now, if you're one of the lucky few that doesn't completely resolve your symptoms, excuse me, you might need to move on to replacing certain things within the digestive system, putting more bacteria in there and repairing. So when it comes to replacing, that's where you want to look at, do you have enough stomach acid? Do you have the symptoms of low stomach acid? Do you have enough digestive enzymes? Do you have undigested material in your stool or fatty stools that float? Or do you get bloated every time you eat? All of these are signs that you might need to support stomach acid or support digestive enzymes with a supplement. A lot of people need to reinoculate. They need more prebiotic fiber, more probiotic support. Again, prebiotics are the fiber. So, again, 80% of your diet from a whole food source, lots of fruits and vegetables, that will give you the prebiotic fiber you need. And then probiotics, again, I've updated this. I think most people need closer to 50 billion. Most kids need at least 25 billion. And I'll say that's a conservative number, compared to what I take and what my kids take. Repair. So there are certain nutrients. So I mentioned a few minerals. So zinc and magnesium are 2 minerals that are critically important when it comes to healing the gut. When your gut is inflamed and leaky, it's this vicious cycle because even if you're eating the right foods, if you have a leaky gut and you're not absorbing the nutrients you need, then you don't have the nutrients you need to heal your gut. So your gut gets worse. And so it becomes this snowball effect. And so sometimes you'll need more therapeutic or higher levels of some of these nutrients to kind of overcome that hump and get the body healing. Or even some of our patients, we have to give nutrients intravenously, so directly into the bloodstream, so that they can get enough so that their body can heal. B vitamins are critically important. And then this L-glutamine, this is an amino acid that you might have heard of if you've done a gut repair program, because, L-glutamine is needed to repair those cells that line the digestive tract. This is also why bone broth is great. Bone broth is high in L-glutamine. So where do we start? There's a lot of information. Of course, my number one is get rid of sugar and eat whole foods. That's, those two things I think are some of the most important things you can do. Of course, reduce additives and preservatives. So, don't buy anything in a box. Shop the perimeter. Number 3, increase your good fats and proteins. So if you're decreasing sugar, you're decreasing an energy source for the body. So you've got to increase your fats, because fats are the other really great energy source for the body. So if you're decreasing sugar, make sure you're increasing good fats in your diet. Decrease simple carbohydrates, so all the processed wheat and sugar and flour, all of that, and increase whole foods. And then last but not least, drink more water. I think everybody can do that. And I always give the gauge, if you take your weight, divide it in half, that's how many ounces of water you should have per day. So it's kind of a good rule of thumb. And if you drink a cup of coffee, you need to drink that equal amount of water to make up for the diuretic effect of that coffee. So you have to drink that in addition to what you're already supposed to be drinking during the day. So, not that I'm a huge fan of coffee, so I don't usually try and dissuade people from drinking coffee, but you just have to be mindful that it will have a diuretic effect. So you need more water to compensate. So apologize, we went a little bit over, and so I don't have time to stick around. Maybe just one or two quick questions if anybody has them. But otherwise, thank you guys for coming today. And again, I know this class goes by. I always think 2 hours. We've got 2 hours, and then it just flies by. And so, like